Close your eyes and imagine a world very different from our own. Imagine roads of stone stretching across mountains and valleys, roads built by an empire so vast, so powerful, so deeply organized that its name still echoes in our language, our laws, our architecture, and our imagination. That empire was Rome, and for 500 years it had been the heartbeat of the Western world. But all heartbeats slow, all fires dim, and sometime in the long, golden afternoon of the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the West began to unravel, not all at once, not in a single dramatic crash, but gradually, like a great tapestry being pulled apart thread by thread. In the year 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus. It was a quiet ending for a world that had once roared. No trumpets sounded. No great battle was fought. A boy was sent away to live in a villa on the Italian coast, and the purple robes of Roman emperorship were folded and sent east to Constantinople, where the Eastern Empire would continue to thrive for nearly another 1,000 years. And so began what we now call the Middle Ages. The term itself is a later invention. Renaissance scholars used it dismissively, as if the centuries between the fall of Rome and their own golden age were merely a waiting room, a parenthesis in history. They were wrong. The Middle Ages were not a gap. They were a world vivid, violent, tender, spiritual, creative, chaotic, and deeply human. A world of kings and serfs, of cathedrals and crusades, of plague and poetry, of faith so fierce it moved mountains, and doubt so quiet it shaped philosophy. Over the next many hours, we will walk through that world together. We will begin in the ruins of Rome and end on the threshold of the Renaissance. We will cross rivers and climb mountains. We will sit in monastery scriptoriums and stand in the halls of great lords. We will listen to monks chanting in the dark before dawn, and we will hear the distant thunder of cavalry on frozen ground. This is the history of medieval Europe. Breathe deeply, let your body rest, and let the story begin. Chapter 1: The World Rome Left Behind. To understand the Middle Ages, we must first understand what was lost and what was not. When Rome fell in the West, it did not vanish overnight. Its roads remained. Its aqueducts continued to carry water in some places for generations. Its language, Latin, did not disappear. It transformed slowly over centuries into the many tongues we now call the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Its laws, its administrative concepts, its very idea of organized government left deep impressions on every successor state that rose in its wake. But the political unity was gone. The great machine of Roman governance, the legions, the tax collectors, the imperial post, the standardized weights and measures, all of it fragmented. And into that fragmentation came peoples whom Roman writers had called, somewhat dismissively, barbarians. These were not savages. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, the Saxons, the Angles, the Burgundians, the Lombards. These were complex societies with their own laws, their own art, their own oral traditions, their own hierarchies of loyalty and honor. Many of them had lived on the edges of Rome for generations, trading with it, serving in its armies, absorbing its culture even as they maintained their own. What they lacked was the Roman tradition of written administration and urban civilization. And so, as they carved up the old Western Empire into kingdoms and territories, the landscape of Europe changed. Cities shrank. Many were abandoned. The great villas of Roman aristocrats fell into disrepair. Literacy declined sharply outside the church. Long-distance trade contracted. The intricate web of economic exchange that had connected the Mediterranean world grew thin and patchy. And yet people still lived. Farmers still planted their fields. Children were still born and named and loved. The sun still rose each morning over the ruins and the new thatched halls alike. Life continued differently, more locally, more uncertainly, but it continued. In the quiet of this transformed world, one institution stood above all others as a keeper of memory, a builder of community, and a source of both comfort and power: the Christian Church. Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. By the time Rome fell in the West, the Church was deeply embedded in every corner of Roman society. It had its own hierarchy, bishops, priests, deacons, its own calendar, its own sacred texts, its own language of worship, and crucially, it had its monasteries. The monasteries would become the great arc of Western civilization through the stormy centuries that followed. In their scriptoriums, those small, cold rooms where monks bent over parchment by candlelight, the classical learning of Rome and Greece was painstakingly copied, preserved, and eventually transmitted to future generations. Without the monks, Virgil might have been lost. Cicero might have crumbled to dust. The mathematical knowledge of the ancient world might have vanished entirely from the West. Instead, it waited, patient as stone, safe within thick walls, until Europe was ready to rediscover it. Chapter 2. The Age of Imaginationes Populares in Motion. Imagine standing on a hillside somewhere in Central Europe in the 5th century. The world around you is forested and dark, broken by occasional clearings where villages of timber and thatch cluster around a well or a small wooden church. The roads, old Roman roads, are still there, cutting through the forest in straight lines that seem almost supernatural in their geometry. And then you notice movement, people on the road, lots of people, families with children and animals, warriors on horses, old men and women walking with staffs, whole communities uprooted, moving west and south and east, driven by pressures from the vast Eurasian steppe. This was the age of migrations, the Völkerwanderung, as German historians would later call it. The movement of peoples that reshaped Europe's ethnic and political map so thoroughly that its echoes can still be felt today. The trigger, most historians now believe, was ultimately the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from the great grasslands of Central Asia. They were extraordinary horsemen, fighters of astonishing speed and ferocity, who swept westward across the steppe in the late 4th century. We know relatively little about them. They left no written records of their own, but we know the effect they had on the peoples in their path. Like a stone dropped into a still pond, their arrival sent ripples outward in every direction. The Goths, who had been living north of the Black Sea and Danube, were among the first to feel the pressure. The Visigoths, the western branch of the Gothic people, crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376, seeking refuge. The Romans, overwhelmed and poorly prepared, mismanaged the situation catastrophically. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths defeated and killed the Roman Emperor Valens, one of the most shocking military disasters in Roman history. This was a turning point. The Visigoths were settled within the empire, but they remained a distinct, armed, semi-autonomous force. The precedent of Germanic peoples living within the empire under their own leaders, loosely allied with Rome but not truly subordinate to it, became a pattern that would repeat again and again. Attila the Hun burst onto the stage of European history in the 430s and 440s, leading devastating raids deep into both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. His armies swept across the Balkans, through Gaul, and into Italy. He was turned back from Rome itself, according to legend by Pope Leo I riding out to meet him, though the more prosaic reality probably involved plague and supply difficulties. And he died in 453, shortly after his wedding night, of a burst blood vessel. With Attila gone, the Hunnic Confederation quickly disintegrated, but the movements of peoples he had set in motion did not stop. The Vandals had already crossed into North Africa by 429, eventually sacking Rome itself in 455. The Ostrogoths would settle in Italy by the 490s under their great king Theodoric. The Franks were consolidating their hold on what is now France. The Anglo-Saxons were crossing the North Sea to settle in Britain, gradually pushing the Romano-British population westward into Wales and Cornwall. This was not simply chaos, though it often felt that way to those living through it. It was transformation. The new kingdoms that emerged from this crucible were not simply Roman provinces with new rulers. They were genuinely new political entities, blending Roman legal and administrative traditions with Germanic customs of personal loyalty, warrior culture, and tribal law. In this blended world, identity was fluid and contested. Were you Roman? Were you Goth? Were you Christian or pagan or something in between? These questions mattered enormously, and different people answered them in different ways, sometimes shifting their answers as political circumstances changed. Out of this fluid, complex, often violent transformation would emerge the kingdoms and cultures of medieval Europe. It would take time, centuries of slow crystallization, but the process had begun. Chapter 3: The Frnks and the Making of Europe. Of all the Germanic peoples who carved up the Western Roman Empire, none would prove more historically significant than the Franks. The Franks were a confederation of Germanic tribes who had long lived along the Lower and Middle Rhine. They were not the most sophisticated of the successor peoples. The Ostrogoths, for instance, were far more deeply Romanized, but they had something the others lacked: staying power, geographical advantage, and eventually, a dynasty of breathtaking ambition. In 481, a young man named Clovis became king of one Frankish tribe. Over the next 30 years, he would transform himself into the ruler of almost all of what is now France and a large part of Germany, unifying the Franks through a combination of military genius, ruthless political cunning, and one crucial religious decision. Around the year 496, the exact date is disputed, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity. This was not a trivial act. Many of the other Germanic rulers of the time were either pagan or adherents of Arianism, a form of Christianity that had been declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325. By becoming Catholic, Clovis aligned himself with the Roman Church and with the majority of his Gallo-Roman subjects. He gained the support of the bishops, who were among the most powerful figures in late antique society, and he wrapped his kingship in the legitimacy of Christian blessing. The Franks became the favored people of the Church in the West, and the Church, in return, became the great legitimizing force behind Frankish power. This partnership would reach its supreme expression 3 centuries later, under a king whose name became synonymous with the idea of Christian Europe itself: Charlemagne. Charles, called the Great, Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne became king of the Franks in 768 and spent the next 4 decades expanding his kingdom into an empire. He conquered the Saxons in a brutal, decades-long campaign that involved forced conversions and massacres. He subdued the Lombards in Italy. He pushed into Spain and Bavaria and the Slavic lands to the east. By the end of his reign, he ruled an empire that covered most of Western and Central Europe, the largest political entity the West had seen since Rome. But Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He was, in his own way, a visionary, deeply serious about his Christian faith and deeply conscious of the civilizational crisis that had followed Rome's fall. He set about trying to rebuild not Rome exactly, but something new that drew on Roman precedent while being unmistakably Frankish and Christian. He reformed the coinage, standardized weights and measures, improved roads and bridges. He established what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a deliberate effort to revive learning, to improve the education of the clergy, to reform the liturgy, to copy and preserve classical texts. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen: the great English scholar Alcuin, who effectively ran the palace school, the Lombard historian Paul the Deacon, the Visigoth poet Theodulf. In the scriptorium at Aachen and in the monasteries under Charlemagne's patronage, a new script was developed, the Carolingian minuscule, a clear, elegant, legible handwriting that replaced the various cramped and regional scripts that had proliferated after Rome's fall. It is not an exaggeration to say that Carolingian minuscule saved classical literature. It was in this script that most surviving copies of Latin classical works were made. When Renaissance scholars later rediscovered these texts and assumed they were looking at ancient Roman handwriting, they were actually reading Carolingian copies. And it was the Carolingian script that became the model for the humanist typefaces that eventually gave us modern lowercase letters. On Christmas Day in the year 800, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd gathered in the basilica shouted their acclamation. A new empire had been born, or more precisely, an old one had been symbolically reborn. Charlemagne himself was reportedly surprised and even annoyed by this development, according to his biographer Einhard. He had not expected the coronation, and he worried about how the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople would react to having a Western rival. But whatever his personal feelings, the symbolic weight of that moment was immense. It established the idea, which would persist for centuries, that there was a special relationship between the papacy and the ruler of Western Christendom, that Christian Europe was in some sense a unified civilization under God, and that legitimate political authority had to be blessed by the Church. These ideas would shape European history in profound ways for the next 700 years. Charlemagne died in 814. His empire did not long outlast him. His son Louis the Pious struggled to hold it together, and at Louis's death it was divided among his 3 sons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This division, roughly into the territories that would become France, Germany, and a Middle Kingdom, laid the very rough geographical foundations of modern Western Europe. But the legacy of Charlemagne went far deeper than borders. He had established the template for what a Christian king should be: a protector of the Church, a promoter of learning, a warrior for the faith, a bringer of order to chaos. Every medieval king who came after him was in some sense measured against his example or defined himself in relation to it. Chapter 4. The Vikings, Children of the North Sea. As the Carolingian Empire was fragmenting in the 9th century, a new force exploded onto the European scene from the north. They came without warning, usually by sea, striking fast and disappearing before any organized defense could respond. They were called Northmen, Norsemen, Danes, Varangians. We call them Vikings. The word Viking itself is disputed in its origins. It may derive from the Old Norse word vik, meaning bay or inlet, suggesting men who lurked in the fjords waiting to raid, or from an Old English word meaning to travel or campaign. Whatever the etymology, the effect of these seafarers on European history was transformative. The Scandinavians, the peoples of what are now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, had long been skilled seafarers and traders. Their homelands were rugged and relatively poor in agricultural terms, but rich in timber, furs, and amber, and perfectly positioned to dominate the trade routes of the North Sea and Baltic. In the late 8th century, a combination of factors, population pressure, political fragmentation at home, the development of exceptionally capable ocean-going ships, and the perception of rich, poorly defended targets abroad led to an explosion of raiding activity. The date traditionally given for the beginning of the Viking Age is 793, the year of the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England. The monastery was wealthy, unfortified, and inhabited by monks who had no means of resistance. The Vikings killed some of the monks, enslaved others, looted the treasures accumulated over generations, and disappeared back to sea before anyone could respond. The shock across Christendom was enormous. A contemporary chronicler wrote that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain, and it was not thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. But it could, and it would happen again and again. In the decades and centuries that followed, Viking raiders struck every coastline of Western and Northern Europe. They attacked Ireland repeatedly, eventually founding the city of Dublin. They sailed up the Seine to threaten Paris. They raided in Spain and Portugal, entered the Mediterranean, attacked the coasts of Italy and North Africa. They discovered Iceland, then Greenland, and eventually, around the year 1000, reached the coast of North America, a full 5 centuries before Columbus. But the Vikings were not only raiders. They were traders and settlers too, often the same people in different circumstances. In what is now Russia and Ukraine, Swedish Vikings called Varangians established a network of river trade routes stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian. They founded or dominated cities like Novgorod and Kiev, and some made their way all the way to Constantinople, where they served as the elite bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, the famous Varangian Guard. In England, Danish Vikings established permanent settlements in the north and east, the Danelaw, and for a time in the early 11th century, a Danish king named Cnut ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously. In Normandy, a Viking chieftain named Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king in 911 in exchange for his conversion to Christianity and his promise to defend the region from further raiding. The Normans, the Northmen, the men from Normandy, went on to become one of the most dynamic and important peoples of the high medieval period, their descendants conquering England in 1066 and establishing kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy. The Viking Age is often portrayed as a time of pure violence and destruction, and certainly there was plenty of both. But it was also a time of extraordinary mobility, cultural exchange, and demographic transformation. The Norse peoples carried their language, their art, their mythology, and their customs across an enormous swath of the known world. They adapted, intermarried, converted to Christianity, and were absorbed into the societies they had once raided, while simultaneously leaving deep impressions on those societies in return. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was essentially over. Scandinavian societies had developed into organized Christian kingdoms, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the era of large-scale raiding had given way to more conventional political and commercial relationships with the rest of Europe. But the world they left behind was significantly different from the one they had entered. Chapter 5. The World of Lords and SERFS, Feudalism and MANORALS. Close your eyes again for a moment. Picture a world without nation-states, without central governments in the modern sense, without police forces or standing armies in the way we understand them. A world where the key questions of life, who will protect me? Who will feed me? Who do I owe loyalty to? Were answered not by abstract institutions, but by face-to-face relationships between real people. This is the world that historians have traditionally called feudal, though the word itself is a later invention, and scholars debate exactly what it means and how universally it applies. But at its core, the feudal system, if we can call it that, was a set of personal relationships based on land, service, and loyalty. At the top of this system sat the king, but in the early and high medieval period, kings were not powerful rulers in the modern sense. They were the greatest lords among lords, the apex of a pyramid of personal relationships. A king granted land, called a fief, to great nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. Those great nobles in turn granted portions of their land to lesser nobles, who did the same to still lesser ones. Each grant created a bond. The lord provided land, protection, and justice. The vassal provided military service, counsel, and loyalty. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the peasants, the men and women who actually worked the land. Most medieval peasants were serfs or villeins, terms that denoted unfree status. They were not slaves in the ancient sense. They could not be bought and sold separately from the land, but they were bound to it. They could not leave without their lord's permission. They owed labor service on the lord's fields, typically several days a week. They paid dues in grain, animals, and other goods. They submitted to the lord's justice in his manor court. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of the agricultural year, plowing in spring, planting, weeding, harvesting in autumn, the long quiet cold of winter when work slowed and the hours of darkness stretched endlessly. The diet was monotonous: Bread, porridge, vegetables from the garden, occasional salt fish or bacon, a little ale. Meat was a luxury. Fresh fruits were seasonal. Salt was precious. And yet there was joy in this life too. Village festivals, weddings and baptisms, the great feasts of the church calendar, Christmas, Easter, midsummer, which provided relief from the grinding routine. The community of the village was tight-knit by necessity. People depended on each other in ways that urban modern life can barely imagine. The great organizing unit of the medieval countryside was the manor. The manor was both a physical place and a legal entity. The lord's residence, which might be anything from a simple timber hall to a stone castle. The surrounding farmland, the village where the peasants lived. The mill, often a monopoly of the lord. The church, the common lands where animals grazed and wood was gathered. Everything within the manor fell under the lord's jurisdiction. The church added another layer to this structure. Every village had its parish church. The parish priest, who might himself be the son of a serf, barely literate, eking out a modest living from the tithe, a tax of 1/10 of agricultural produce, and small fees for baptisms, weddings, and burials, was often the most educated person in the village. The church building was not only a place of worship but a community center, a meeting place, a refuge in times of danger. The bell that hung in its tower regulated the rhythms of the day, calling people to prayer and marking the hours of work and rest. Above the parish priest sat the bishop, governing a diocese that might encompass hundreds of parishes. Above the bishops sat archbishops, and above them all in Rome sat the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, the spiritual head of all Latin Christendom. This dual structure, the secular hierarchy of kings, lords, and serfs, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy of popes, bishops, and priests, was the fundamental architecture of medieval European society. The two hierarchies were constantly in tension, constantly negotiating, sometimes cooperating magnificently and sometimes clashing with world-shaking fury. But they were both, in their different ways, expressions of the same fundamental medieval insight, that human society was ordered, that order came from God, and that every person had a place within that divine order. Chapter 6. The Church in the Early Middle Ages, Saints, Monks, and Missionaries. Let us pause in our journey through the political and social landscape of medieval Europe and enter a different kind of world, a quieter world, a world of candlelight and incense, of silence and slow chant, of men and women who believed, with an intensity we may find difficult to fully imagine, that they were living in the shadow of eternity. The Christian Church in the early Middle Ages was not a single monolithic institution. It was a vast, sprawling, diverse family of communities, practices, and traditions, bound together by shared scripture, shared sacraments, shared allegiance to Rome, and the shared conviction that Jesus Christ had died and risen again, and that this fact changed everything. At the heart of the early medieval church was the monastery. The monastic impulse in Christianity was very old, going back to the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries, men and women who withdrew from society into the wilderness to pray, fast, and seek God in silence. By the 5th and 6th centuries, monasticism had spread throughout the Christian world, taking many different forms. In the West, the dominant form came to be Benedictine monasticism, named for its founder Benedict of Nursia, an Italian nobleman who lived from around 480 to 547. Benedict wrote a rule for his community at Monte Cassino that was remarkable for its wisdom, its psychological perceptiveness, and its practical humanity. The Benedictine rule organized the monastic day around a cycle of prayer, the divine office, 8 times daily from the middle of the night through the day to the evening, interspersed with manual labor and sacred reading. It was balanced, sustainable, designed for ordinary human beings rather than spiritual supermen. Ora et labora, pray and work. This simple formula became the heartbeat of Western monasticism for centuries. Benedictine monasteries spread across Europe in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, sometimes founded by kings who wanted to secure divine favor, and sometimes by noblemen who saw monastic patronage as both a pious duty and a social advantage. By the Carolingian period, great monasteries like St. Gall in Switzerland, Fulda in Germany, Corbie in France, and Jarrow in England were flourishing centers of learning, agriculture, craft, and prayer. The monks who inhabited these places lived lives of extraordinary regularity and discipline. They rose before dawn for the first office of the day, matins, sometimes called vigils, and chanted the psalms in the cold darkness of the church. They processed through 7 more rounds of prayer over the course of the day. They spent hours in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts in that careful Carolingian hand, creating books that were themselves objects of extraordinary beauty, illuminated with gold and brilliant pigments, bound in covers of carved ivory or jeweled metalwork. They were also farmers, engineers, and managers. The great monasteries cleared forests, drained swamps, built mills and bridges, developed advanced agricultural techniques. The Cistercian monasteries of the 12th century, in particular, would become extraordinarily efficient agricultural enterprises, their lay brothers transforming marginal land across Europe. But perhaps the most dramatic expression of the early medieval church's energy was the missionary impulse, the drive to bring Christianity to the peoples who had not yet heard the gospel. Ireland, never conquered by Rome, had been converted to Christianity in the 5th century largely through the efforts of a former slave named Patrick, who had been carried off from Britain and who returned to the island of his captivity as a bishop. Irish Christianity developed its own distinctive character, intensely ascetic, deeply scholarly, organized around monasteries rather than dioceses, with a love of nature and a tradition of spiritual writing of remarkable beauty. From Ireland in the 6th century, missionaries went out to re-evangelize much of Western Europe. The great Columba founded the island monastery of Iona off the coast of Scotland, which became a center of Celtic Christian culture of enormous influence. Columbanus traveled to the Frankish kingdom and beyond, founding monasteries and rebuking sinful kings with equal vigor. Aidan went from Iona to Northumbria in northeastern England and founded the monastery of Lindisfarne, the same Lindisfarne that would be raided by Vikings 2 centuries later. From the south, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine to England in 597, establishing what would become the Roman Catholic Church in England. The two Christian traditions, the Celtic from Ireland and Iona, the Roman from Canterbury, met, sometimes cooperated, sometimes clashed, and ultimately merged. In the 7th and 8th centuries, English missionaries carried Christianity to the Germanic peoples across the North Sea. The most famous of these was Winfrith, known to history as Boniface, the Apostle of Germany, who spent decades evangelizing among the Frisians, Saxons, and Thuringians, organizing the German church into proper dioceses, and finally dying a martyr in 754 at the age of 79, killed by pagan Frisians. The Christianization of Europe was a long, complex, sometimes violent process. It involved genuine conversion of the heart, and it involved political coercion, Charlemagne's forced baptism of the Saxons being the most notorious example. It involved the gradual absorption of pagan customs into Christian practice, the midwinter festival becoming Christmas, the spring fertility festival becoming Easter, the feast days of local heroes becoming the feasts of saints. It involved a constant negotiation between the universal claims of the church and the particular traditions of countless local communities. But by the end of the first millennium, the process was essentially complete in Western Europe. The peoples of France, Germany, England, Italy, Spain, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and Scandinavia all identified themselves as Christian. They might quarrel ferociously about what that meant in practice, and they did, but the shared identity was real and profound. Chapter 7. the Byzantine world and the Eastern Roman Empire. While Western Europe was going through its painful, creative transformation after the fall of Rome, the eastern half of the old empire continued. We call it the Byzantine Empire, though the Byzantines themselves called it simply the Roman Empire. They never stopped thinking of themselves as Romans. Constantinople, the city founded by the Emperor Constantine in 330 on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, was one of the great wonders of the medieval world. It sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the Strait of the Bosphorus, commanding trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Its walls, the massive Theodosian walls built in the 5th century, were virtually impregnable, withstanding siege after siege for 1,000 years. Its great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly a millennium, its great dome seeming to float on a ring of light as if suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565, was perhaps the greatest of all Byzantine emperors. With his brilliant general Belisarius and the formidable Empress Theodora at his side, Justinian reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, temporarily reuniting much of the old Roman Mediterranean world. He codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code, which became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and remains influential to this day. He built Hagia Sophia and dozens of other churches across his empire. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure. But the reconquests proved unsustainable. Italy was devastated by decades of warfare and then, almost immediately after Byzantine reconquest, invaded again by the Lombards. The empire was also battered by a catastrophic bubonic plague, the Plague of Justinian, which struck in 541 and recurred repeatedly for the next 2 centuries, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population of the Mediterranean world. The great epidemic presaged the better-known Black Death by 8 centuries, and its demographic effects may have been equally devastating. After Justinian, the Byzantine Empire contracted, fighting desperately on multiple fronts, against the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east, against the Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, and then, most dramatically, against the new Arab Islamic Caliphate that erupted from the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s. In just a few decades, the Arabs conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, territories that had been part of the Roman world for centuries. They twice besieged Constantinople itself, in the 670s and again in 717–718, and were turned back both times. The Byzantine Empire survived, but as a much smaller and more Greek entity, centered on Anatolia, Greece, and the Balkans. The Byzantines were remarkable preservers and transmitters of classical culture. Their scholars read Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek. Their artists developed the distinctive style of Byzantine art, the golden mosaics, the elongated figures of saints against golden backgrounds, the hieratic stillness that aimed to convey the eternal rather than the temporal. Their theologians engaged in extraordinarily sophisticated debates about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and the proper relationship between the sacred image and the divine reality it represented. Byzantium remained a major power and cultural center throughout the medieval period, a constant presence on the eastern horizon of Western European consciousness. Admired, envied, sometimes despised, occasionally allied with, occasionally fought against. Its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 would send ripples of shock across Christendom and contribute to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. Chapter 8. The Rise of Islam and its Impact on Europe. In the year 610, in a cave on Mount Hira near the city of Mecca in Arabia, a merchant named Mohammed received the first of what he believed were divine revelations from the angel Gabriel. Over the next 23 years, These revelations continued, eventually forming the sacred text of a new religion, Islam. Muhammad's message was radical in its simplicity and power. There is only one God, Allah, the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians, and Muhammad is his final prophet. The duties of the Muslim surrender, which is what Islam means to God, were clear. Prayer 5 times daily, almsgiving, fasting during the month of Ramadan, pilgrimage to Mecca if possible, and the profession of faith. The community of believers, the Ummah, transcended all tribal, ethnic, and social divisions. Muhammad died in 632, but the faith and the community he founded continued to grow with astonishing speed. Under the first 4 caliphs, the successors to Muhammad, Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula with a combination of religious fervor, military skill, and opportunistic genius. Within a century of Muhammad's death, the Islamic world stretched from Spain in the west to the borders of India in the east, the fastest expansion of any empire in human history. The impact on Europe was profound and lasting. In the west, Arab and Berber forces crossed from North Africa into Spain in 711, and within a few years had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. They pushed into France, where they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, in 732 by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. This battle has been mythologized as the moment that saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest, though historians debate exactly how decisive it actually was. Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, became one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the medieval world. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada were centers of learning, arts, and commerce that far outstripped anything in contemporary Christian Europe. The Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, who reigned in Cordoba in the 10th century, presided over a court of extraordinary luxury and intellectual brilliance. The Great Library of Cordoba reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time, when most Western monasteries had a few hundred. In Muslim Spain, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in a complex arrangement that scholars have called convivencia, coexistence. It was not always peaceful or equal. Non-Muslims paid special taxes and faced various legal disabilities. But it was far more tolerant than what either Jews or Muslims generally experienced in Christian Europe. And crucially, it was in this multicultural environment that the classical learning of ancient Greece, preserved and developed in Arabic translation, began to flow back into Latin Europe. The translation movement, centered in Toledo after its Christian reconquest in 1085, saw generations of scholars working to translate Arabic texts, and through them, Greek texts, into Latin. Works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy, along with the Arabic commentaries and developments by scholars like Avicenna and Averroes, poured into the Latin intellectual world, sparking a revolution in philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and science that would help create the universities and eventually feed into the Renaissance. Islam also shaped medieval Europe through conflict. The Crusades, the great military expeditions launched by Western Christendom to recover the Holy Land from Muslim rule, were in large part a response to the expansion of Islam and the disruption of Christian pilgrimage. But they were also shaped by internal European dynamics, the energy of a population expanding rapidly, the violence of a warrior class that needed an outlet, the spiritual ambitions of a reformed church, the political calculations of popes and emperors. We will come to the Crusades in due course. For now, let us simply note that the relationship between medieval Europe and the Islamic world was one of the central dynamics of the period, sometimes hostile, sometimes commercial, always consequential. Chapter 9. The year 1000, Fear, Faith, and the Turning of the Millennium. As the year 1000 approached, some people in medieval Europe feared the end of the world. The idea of the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ foretold in the book of Revelation, had long been a subject of theological speculation. Some interpreters believed that the year 1000 would mark either the return of Christ or some dramatic upheaval in the divine order. The precise extent of this millennial anxiety in the actual year 1000 has been debated by historians. Some argue it has been greatly exaggerated, others that it was genuinely widespread. But it is clear that the turn of the millennium was freighted with meaning. And yet the world did not end. The sun rose on January 1, 1000 as it had on every other day. Farmers went about their work. Kings pursued their campaigns. Monks chanted their offices. The great machinery of medieval life ground on. But the world was changing. The 11th century marked a significant turning point in European history, the beginning of a period of expansion, creativity, and complexity that historians call the High Middle Ages. Population was growing. After the demographic disasters of the migration period and the plague of Justinian, European populations had stabilized and then begun to increase. Improved agricultural techniques, the heavy plow, the horse collar, the three-field system, were making the land more productive. New land was being cleared from forest and drained from swamp. Villages were growing. Markets were expanding. Trade was reviving. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were becoming significant commercial powers, their merchants linking the Mediterranean world into networks of exchange. The great fairs of Champagne in France brought together merchants from across Europe. Money, which had been scarce and marginal for much of the early Middle Ages, was becoming more important, more abundant, more central to economic life. Cities were growing, not all at once, not uniformly, but the trend was unmistakable. Towns that had been tiny in 900 were becoming significant centers of population, craft, and commerce by 1100 or 1150. And with the growth of towns came new social groups, merchants, artisans, lawyers, teachers, whose interests and values did not fit neatly into the old framework of lords, serfs, and clergy. The church was also changing. The 10th century had seen a significant decline in ecclesiastical standards. Bishops appointed by kings for political reasons, monasteries run by laymen, priests who lived openly with wives and children, popes sometimes installed by Roman noble families for family reasons rather than spiritual merit. The reform movement that began at the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy in 910 sought to restore the independence, discipline, and spiritual vitality of the church. Cluny itself grew from a small reformed monastery to the head of an enormous network of monasteries across Europe, all under the direct authority of the abbot of Cluny, and all exempt from local episcopal and lay control. At its height, the Cluniac network included hundreds of monasteries and was one of the most powerful institutional forces in Europe. The reforming energy spread from the monasteries to the papacy itself. A series of reform popes in the mid-11th century, culminating in the extraordinary Gregory VII, who reigned from 1073 to 1085, set out to transform the papacy into an active, interventionist force in European affairs. Gregory VII claimed unprecedented papal authority, the power to depose emperors, to release subjects from their oaths of loyalty to sinful rulers, to be the final judge of all spiritual and even temporal matters in Christendom. This brought him into direct conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, in a dispute that rocked medieval Europe to its foundations. Chapter 10: The Investiture Controversy, Pope versus Emperor. The central issue was this: who had the right to appoint bishops? It seems, on the surface, like a technical ecclesiastical question, but in the medieval world it was anything but. Bishops were not merely religious leaders. They were great landowners, political figures, administrators, military vassals. The bishop of a major diocese controlled enormous wealth and wielded enormous secular as well as spiritual power. Whoever controlled the appointment of bishops controlled a major portion of the political and economic life of a kingdom. For centuries, kings had appointed bishops. The ceremony involved the king investing the new bishop with the symbols of his office, the ring and the staff, before the ecclesiastical ceremony of consecration. This practice, known as lay investiture, was deeply embedded in the political system. Kings depended on their bishops as administrators and military supporters. Pope Gregory VII declared that this practice was a scandal, that the church must be free from lay control, that only the pope could appoint bishops, that any king who practiced lay investiture was defying God and would face excommunication. Henry IV of Germany refused to accept this. He was a young, ambitious emperor who needed his bishops as political allies. He called a synod of German bishops who dutifully voted to depose Gregory. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry, declaring him cut off from the Christian community, his subjects released from their oaths of loyalty. The excommunication was devastating in its political effects. Henry's German nobles, who had their own reasons for wanting to curb royal power, seized the opportunity to revolt. Henry found himself isolated, his authority collapsing. In January 1077, Henry did something astonishing. He traveled to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Gregory was staying, and stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates for 3 days, dressed as a penitent, begging for forgiveness. Gregory, as a priest bound by the duty of mercy, could not refuse to absolve a genuinely penitent sinner. He lifted the excommunication. The scene at Canossa, the most powerful secular ruler in Western Christendom humbling himself before the Pope, became one of the most famous images of the entire medieval period. It seemed to represent the triumph of spiritual over secular authority. But the reality was more complex. Henry, once absolved, promptly returned to his old ways. He defeated his German opponents, appointed a rival pope, and drove Gregory VII into exile in Salerno, where the great reformer died in 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." The investiture controversy was not resolved at Canossa. It dragged on for decades, eventually settled in Germany at least by the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which established an uneasy compromise. Popes would appoint bishops, but kings retained certain rights in the process. But the deeper question, the proper relationship between spiritual and secular authority in Christendom, was never fully resolved. It would continue to generate conflict, sometimes violent, sometimes merely rhetorical, throughout the rest of the Middle Ages. Chapter 11, the CRUSADES, God WLLS It. On November 27, 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II made a speech that changed the world. We do not have the exact text of Urban's speech. The accounts that survive were all written some years after the event, and they differ in significant details, but the substance is clear enough. Urban called on the warriors of Christendom to cease their endless warfare against each other, and instead march to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, which had been under Muslim rule since 638, to liberate it, and to aid the Eastern Christians of Byzantium who had been suffering under Turkish attacks. The crowd's response, by all accounts, was electric. Deus vult, God wills it. The cry went up again and again. Men began immediately to sew crosses on their shoulders as a sign of their vow to go on crusade. What followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes in medieval history. The First Crusade, which set out in 1096 and captured Jerusalem in 1099, was in many ways a miracle of improvisation. There was no central command, no unified army, no reliable supply system. Various armies of knights, foot soldiers, and camp followers from France, from the Norman territories, from southern Italy, from the Rhineland gathered, argued, marched, starved, fought, and somehow made their way across 2,000 miles of hostile territory to the Holy Land. Before the main armies even set out, a disorganized popular movement known as the People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher called Peter the Hermit, streamed eastward through Germany and Hungary. They committed terrible massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland along the way, the first large-scale anti-Jewish pogroms in European history. Most of the People's Crusade was annihilated by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The main armies fared better. They were poorly coordinated but included some of the finest knights of the age, and they had the advantage of fighting opponents who were themselves divided and often suspicious of each other. In an agonizing 3-year campaign of sieges, battles, and sheer endurance, the Crusaders pushed through Anatolia, besieged Antioch and captured it after a nightmarish 8-month siege, and finally arrived before the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099. Jerusalem fell on July 15, 1099. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders killed a large proportion of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in scenes of violence that shocked even some of their contemporaries. One eyewitness account described men wading through blood up to their ankles in the streets. But the Crusaders also built. In the Holy Land, they established 4 Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These were remarkable institutions, multicultural societies in which Frankish knights, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in close proximity, often with more tolerance than the ideology of crusade might suggest. The Crusader lords often found more in common with their Muslim counterparts than with newly arrived pilgrims from the West, whose enthusiasm for violence was not always matched by political wisdom. The Crusader states were always vulnerable, dependent on resupply and reinforcement from Western Europe across a long and uncertain supply line. In 1144, the County of Edessa fell to the Muslim ruler Zengi, prompting the Second Crusade, which accomplished little. In 1187, the great Kurdish general Saladin, one of the most admired figures in both Islamic and European medieval history, defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and retook Jerusalem. The news of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Christendom. It prompted the Third Crusade, the most famous of all, the one that pitted Saladin against Richard I of England, who history and legend know as Richard the Lionheart. Richard was a remarkable figure, brave to the point of recklessness, a gifted military commander, a troubadour who wrote poetry in Occitan and in French, a king who spent less than a year of his 10-year reign in England. He led his crusading force with great energy and tactical skill, winning major battles and capturing the coastal city of Acre after a long siege. But he could never quite gather the resources to recapture Jerusalem itself. In 1192, he concluded a truce with Saladin that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, but guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to the city's holy sites. The two leaders, Richard and Saladin, became the central characters of one of history's great chivalric legends. Even contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, acknowledged the courage, the courtesy, and the mutual respect that characterized their relationship, though they fought each other with ruthless determination. There were 6 more officially numbered crusades after the Third, and dozens of smaller campaigns. The Fourth Crusade, 1202–1204, ended in catastrophe when the Crusaders, diverted by Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine dynastic politics, sacked Constantinople instead of attacking Egypt. The sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city looted by crusading Christians, was a wound in the relationship between the Latin West and the Greek East that never fully healed, contributing to the final separation of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. The Crusades continued into the 13th century and beyond, but never again came close to the dramatic success of the First Crusade. The last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, the city of Acre, fell to the Mamluks in 1291. The legacy of the Crusades is complex and contested. They caused enormous suffering for the peoples of the Middle East and for Jews in Europe, who were repeatedly massacred by crusading mobs. They contributed to the alienation of Eastern Orthodox Christians from the Latin West. They were, in many ways, a catastrophic failure on their own terms. And yet they also brought Europeans into sustained contact with the more advanced civilizations of the Islamic world and Byzantium, facilitating the transmission of learning, art, technology, and commercial techniques that would help fuel the intellectual and economic transformation of the High Middle Ages. They generated a vast literature of chronicles, poems, songs, and romances that helped shape European cultural identity. And they left an enduring mark on the collective imagination of the Western world that continues to resonate today. Chapter 12. The High Middle Ages, CATHEDRALS, UNIVRSITIS, and the Flowering of Culture. Sometime around the middle of the 12th century, something remarkable began to happen in the towns of northern France. Workers began to dig foundations. Stones were quarried and transported. Scaffolding went up. And slowly, over decades that stretched sometimes into centuries, the great Gothic cathedrals began to rise. The Gothic cathedral is one of the supreme achievements of medieval civilization, perhaps of any civilization. To stand inside Chartres or Notre Dame de Paris, Amiens or Cologne, is to experience something that defies easy description. The stones that weigh thousands of tons seem to be floating, lifted upward by a logic that feels supernatural. The light that pours through the stained glass transforms the interior into something that is not quite the ordinary material world. This was entirely intentional. The Gothic cathedral was designed as an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God described in the book of Revelation. Its soaring height was meant to lift the spirit upward toward the divine. Its stained glass windows, which medieval theologians described as the Bible of the poor, since most people could not read, told the stories of Scripture and the lives of saints in jeweled light. Its proportions were calculated according to mathematical ratios, believed to reflect the harmony of the cosmos. The technical innovations that made Gothic architecture possible were extraordinary. The pointed arch, which could bear weight more efficiently than the rounded Romanesque arch, allowing thinner walls and greater height. The ribbed vault, which channeled the weight of the roof along defined structural paths. And above all, the flying buttress, an external arch that transferred the outward thrust of the roof away from the wall itself, allowing the walls to be opened up with enormous windows. The engineers who designed these structures, who had no computer models, no precise structural calculations, who worked entirely from intuition, experience, and proportion, made astonishing achievements. They also made mistakes. Some cathedrals collapsed during construction and had to be rebuilt, but the successful ones have stood for 800 years and more. At the same time that the cathedrals were rising, another kind of institution was taking shape in the towns of Europe: the university. The universities emerged from cathedral schools, schools attached to great cathedrals where the clergy were trained. At Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere, these schools attracted students from across Europe and gradually organized themselves into the more formal institution we recognize as a university, with its faculties, degrees, and corporate identity. The University of Paris, founded in the early 12th century and formally organized around 1200, became the intellectual capital of medieval Europe. It was here that the great synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy was worked out, the intellectual achievement that we call scholasticism. The key figure in this synthesis was Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar born in Italy around 1225, who spent much of his career in Paris. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, the Summary of Theology, is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever undertaken. A comprehensive, systematic account of Christian doctrine that engaged at every point with the philosophy of Aristotle and with the best objections that reason could mount against faith. Thomas believed that faith and reason were not enemies but complementary paths to truth. God had created both the world of nature, which reason could investigate, and the world of scripture and tradition, which faith received. The two could not genuinely contradict each other, though they might appear to do so from limited perspectives. The task of the theologian was to show how they harmonized. This was a magnificent and deeply optimistic vision, and the Summa Theologiae is a monument to it. Thousands of pages of argument, objection, and reply, covering everything from the existence of God to the morality of usury, from the nature of angels to the proper conduct of war. Thomas never finished it. He stopped writing in December 1273, reportedly saying that everything he had written seemed like straw compared to what he had experienced in mystical contemplation. He died a few months later. The 13th century was in many ways the high point of medieval culture, the moment when all the different strands of the medieval achievement seemed to come together in a grand synthesis. The cathedrals were rising. The universities were flourishing. The great religious orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans, founded in the early 13th century, were bringing a new intensity of preaching and pastoral care to the growing urban populations. Trade was expanding. Literacy was increasing. The Franciscans deserve special mention. Francis of Assisi, born around 1181 to a wealthy merchant family, renounced his inheritance and embraced a life of radical poverty in imitation of Christ. He preached to birds and wolves as well as people, cared for lepers, and inspired thousands to follow him in a life of joyful simplicity. The Franciscan movement he started became one of the largest religious orders in the Church, though its early radical spirit was gradually tempered by institutional necessities. Francis himself is one of the most beloved figures in the history of Christianity, a man of extraordinary personal charm, spiritual depth, and ecological sensitivity who seems, across the centuries, to speak to something very modern in our experience of the sacred. Chapter 13. The Black Death the world turned upside down. And then came the plague. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships arrived in the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors were dying black swellings, the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, black blotches on the skin, high fever, foul-smelling breath. The port authorities ordered the ships out of harbor, but it was too late. The disease was already ashore. What the ships brought was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. It had been traveling westward along the trade routes from Central Asia for years, devastating populations as it went. Now it had reached Europe. The Black Death, as it would later be called, swept through Europe with terrifying speed and lethality. In Italy, it spread from port to port, then inland. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. By 1349, it had crossed the Channel to England and continued north into Scandinavia. By 1351–351, it had reached Poland and Russia. The death toll was catastrophic. Modern scholars estimate that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe, perhaps 25 million people in a continent of 75 million. In some regions and cities, the mortality was even higher. Florence, one of the most prosperous cities in Europe, lost perhaps 60% of its population. Some villages were completely depopulated. The psychological effect was as devastating as the demographic one. People watched their neighbors, their family members, their priests, and their lords die horribly, often within days of the first symptoms. The Church, which was supposed to provide comfort and the last sacraments to the dying, was overwhelmed and terrifyingly susceptible, since its clergy came into close contact with the sick and dying. Many priests fled, leaving their flocks to die unconfessed. The social order was shaken to its foundations. The old explanations, God punishes the sinful, the Church intercedes for the faithful, seemed to collapse in the face of an indiscriminate mortality that killed the good and the evil, the devout and the irreverent alike. Some people responded with intensified piety. The flagellant movement, groups of people who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as penance for humanity's sins, spread rapidly, despite condemnation from the papacy. Others responded with despair, nihilism, or a wild carp diem hedonism. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and wrote about it in the preface to his Decameron, described people who believed that the surest medicine was to drink and be merry and to satisfy every appetite, singing and dancing, eating well, and laughing at everything. In the streets outside, the bodies piled up uncollected because there was no one left to bury them. The Jews of Europe became scapegoats. Rumors spread that they had poisoned the wells, a charge with no basis in reality, since Jews died of the plague in the same proportions as Christians. Nevertheless, Jewish communities across Germany, France, and Switzerland were massacred by mobs. It was one of the darkest chapters in European Jewish history before the 20th century. The long-term social effects of the Black Death were paradoxical. In some ways, the massive reduction in population led to improved conditions for those who survived. Land that had been overcrowded was now empty. Labor that had been cheap was now scarce. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages and better conditions. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism were weakened. The power of the old landed aristocracy relative to the merchant class shifted. The intellectual and religious ferment generated by the plague contributed to the questioning of established authority that would eventually find expression in the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later. If the Church could not protect its people from this horror, what was its authority really worth? If God allowed such indiscriminate suffering, what kind of God was He? These were not questions that had easy answers. They hung in the European air for generations, slowly transforming the intellectual and spiritual landscape. Chapter 14. The 100 Years' War, England and France in conflict. While the Black Death was still killing and the recovery from it was ongoing, Western Europe was also experiencing one of its most protracted and devastating political conflicts, the 100 Years' War between England and France. The name is a later historian's convenience. The conflict actually lasted from 1337 to 1453, a period of 116 years, though with long truces and periods of relative peace interspersed with the fighting. And it was not simply one war but a series of related conflicts, driven by a complex mixture of dynastic claims, feudal obligations, national identity, and economic interests. The immediate cause was a dynastic dispute. When the last direct male heir of the French Capetian dynasty died in 1328, the English king Edward III, whose mother was a French princess, claimed the French throne. The French rejected this claim in favor of a cousin, Philip VI, who founded the Valois dynasty. But Edward did not give up his claim, and in 1337 he pressed it by force. The early phase of the war saw spectacular English victories. At Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, English armies using the longbow, a weapon that could pierce plate armor at considerable range, devastated larger French forces. At Poitiers, the French King John II was actually captured and held for ransom, the greatest humiliation in French history. But these victories could not translate into lasting conquest. France was too large, too populous, too resilient. English armies could raid and win battles but could not hold the country. The conflict dragged on, interrupted repeatedly by plague, financial exhaustion, and political crises in both countries. In the early 15th century, the English came closest to achieving their ambitions. Henry V, Shakespeare's Golden Warrior King, though the real man was both more complex and more ruthless than the theatrical version, won the astonishing victory of Agincourt in 1415 against a French army many times the size of his own. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he was recognized as heir to the French throne, and he married the French king's daughter. Henry V died in 1422 at the age of 35, leaving a 9-month-old son as king of both England and France. The political situation was desperate for the French Valois cause. And then, in 1429, from a small village in Lorraine, came an astonishing figure who would change the course of the war and become one of the most famous people in all of history. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, was a peasant girl of about 17, when she presented herself to the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned French heir, at his court at Chinon. She told him that she had been hearing the voices of saints Michael, Catherine, Margaret, who had commanded her to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned king. What happened next defies easy rational explanation. Joan was given an army. She led it to the relief of the besieged city of Orleans, which had been under English siege for months. She inspired the demoralized French forces with her absolute certainty, her physical courage, and the almost electrical effect of her presence. Orleans was relieved. The English were pushed back. Charles was crowned at Reims in July 1429, with Joan standing beside him, her banner held high. Joan was captured by the Burgundians, allies of England, in 1430 and sold to the English. She was tried for heresy and witchcraft by an ecclesiastical court dominated by English and pro-English French clergy. After a long and complex trial in which she defended herself with remarkable intelligence and spirit, she was condemned and burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30, 1431. She was 19 years old. The English thought they had eliminated the problem. Instead, they had created a martyr. Joan's memory continued to inspire French resistance. The political and military tide, already turning, continued to shift. By 1453, the English had been driven from all of France except the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War was effectively over. Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint in 1920. She remains one of the most compelling and mysterious figures in European history. A peasant girl who changed the fate of a kingdom, who heard voices that drove her to extraordinary courage, and who died for her faith and her king at an age when most modern young people are still in school. Chapter 15. Medieval Women Lives Hidden and Remarkable. We have spoken of many men, kings and emperors, popes and warriors, philosophers and poets, but half of the medieval population was female, and their lives, sometimes hidden from the historical record, sometimes emerging from it with startling vividness, were as rich and complex as those of their male contemporaries. The Church's official position on women was deeply ambivalent. Women were daughters of Eve, whose curiosity had brought sin into the world. They were weaker in reason and stronger in passion. They needed to be governed by men, husbands, fathers, brothers, or the Church itself. Virginity was the highest spiritual state. Marriage was a concession to human weakness. Motherhood was redemptive. And yet the same Church venerated the Virgin Mary with an intensity that shaped art, theology, and devotion throughout the medieval period. The figure of Mary, sinless, compassionate, interceding with her Son for sinful humanity, was a counterweight to the misogynistic strand of medieval theology. The cult of Mary generated some of the most beautiful art and architecture of the medieval world. Many of the great Gothic cathedrals were dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. In practice, women's lives in the Middle Ages ranged across an enormous spectrum. At one extreme were the queens and great noblewomen who exercised real political power, sometimes openly, as regents for absent or minor sons, sometimes indirectly, through influence over husbands and sons. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was queen first of France and then of England, who led a crusade, who governed her duchy, who played a central role in the politics of 3 decades, is perhaps the most dramatic example, but she was not unique. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, managed the household economy with great skill, bore children frequently, infant mortality was high, and families needed many children to ensure some survived, and found community in the village church, in the rhythms of cooperative work, in the festivals and celebrations that punctuated the agricultural year. Urban women participated in the economic life of medieval towns to a degree that often surprises modern readers. In many craft guilds, widows could inherit their husbands' positions. In some trades, brewing, textile production, retail commerce, women were major participants. The records of medieval cities reveal women working as doctors, merchants, innkeepers, moneylenders, and practitioners of dozens of crafts. For women of intellectual or spiritual vocation, the religious life offered real opportunities. The convent was not simply a place to park unwanted daughters, though it was sometimes used that way by families unable or unwilling to provide dowries. It was also a genuine intellectual and spiritual community where women could read, write, manage complex institutions, and exercise authority over other women and sometimes over men. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire medieval period. She was a theologian, a mystic, a poet, a composer, a naturalist, and a healer. Her visionary writings, describing visions of luminous divine light that she received from childhood, were examined and approved by Pope Eugenius III on the advice of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the age. She composed the largest body of medieval music by any known composer. She corresponded with emperors, popes, and bishops, rebuking and advising them with sovereign confidence. She was declared a doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to receive this title by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012. Margery Kempe, an English laywoman of the early 15th century, dictated what is considered the first autobiography in English. A vivid, sometimes comic, sometimes deeply moving account of her mystical experiences, her pilgrimages, and her difficult relationships with her husband, her confessors, and a world that found her weeping and dramatic spirituality alternately impressive and insufferable. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English anchoress who lived walled into a small cell attached to a church, wrote one of the most profound theological works in English literature, The Revelations of Divine Love, in which she explored a vision of divine love so radical and so tender that it continues to astonish readers. Her most famous line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," has the quality of a lullaby for the soul. These women were exceptional, as exceptional individuals always are. But they remind us that the medieval world contained multitudes, that within the constraints and inequalities of their society, women found ways to live, to create, to love, to think, and to leave traces in the historical record that speak to us still. Chapter 16: The Medieval Economy, Trade, TOWNS, and the Birth of Capitalism. For most of the early Middle Ages, the European economy was fundamentally local and agricultural. Most people ate what they or their neighbors grew. Long-distance trade existed. It never entirely disappeared, but it was limited in scale and mostly confined to luxury goods: spices, silk, fine metalwork, precious stones. Beginning in the 10th and 11th centuries, this began to change. Trade revived. Towns grew. Money became more important. And by the 12th and 13th centuries, a genuinely commercial economy was emerging in parts of Europe, especially in Italy, Flanders, and the Rhineland, that in some important ways prefigured the capitalism of the modern world. The Italian city-states were the pioneers. Venice, which had maintained a continuous commercial relationship with the Byzantine Empire and the East throughout the early medieval period, was in many ways the most sophisticated commercial city in the West. Venetian merchants developed financial instruments, partnership contracts, insurance, bills of exchange, that allowed them to conduct large-scale, long-distance trade with manageable risk. They invented or adapted techniques of accounting, including double entry bookkeeping, that provided the foundation for modern business accounting. The great trading families of Florence, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici, developed banking on a European scale, lending to kings and popes, running branches in cities across the continent, managing exchange rates between the different currencies that proliferated in the medieval world's patchwork of political jurisdictions. In Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League, a confederation of German trading cities that at its height included more than 200 towns, dominated trade across the Baltic and North Sea, controlling the commerce in herring, grain, timber, furs, and cloth that sustained the economies of Northern Europe. The Hanse merchants were tough, practical and effective, less glamorous than the Venetians or Florentines, but in their way just as important. The great fairs of Champagne in France served as the central exchange point of European commerce for much of the 12th and 13th centuries. Twice a year, merchants from Italy and Flanders and Germany and England converged on the towns of Champagne to exchange the textiles of the north for the spices and silks of the south. They settled their debts, drew up contracts, and drove the commercial integration of Europe. The growth of trade in towns created new social classes and new tensions. The merchants and artisans of the towns, the bourgeoisie, from the French bourgeois, a town dweller, did not fit neatly into the old framework of lords and serfs. They had property and skills and money, but not noble blood. They wanted legal security for their trade, reliable courts, trustworthy money, and freedom from arbitrary interference by local lords. They organized themselves into guilds and communes, negotiated charters of self-government from kings and lords, and gradually created the institutions of urban self-government that were the distant ancestors of modern local democracy. The medieval guild deserves particular attention. The guild was a fraternity of craftsmen or merchants in a particular trade who collectively regulated their craft, setting standards of quality, controlling who could practice the trade, training apprentices, providing mutual support to members in difficulty. The guild was simultaneously an economic institution, a social welfare organization, a religious brotherhood. Guilds typically had patron saints and participated in religious processions and festivals, and a political force within the town. Guild membership was structured around the progression from apprentice to journeyman to master. An apprentice might spend 7 to 10 years in training, living with the master's family, learning the craft from the bottom up. A journeyman traveled from city to city, working for different masters, developing and demonstrating skill. A master who could produce a masterpiece, a work of sufficient quality to demonstrate full command of the craft, was admitted to full membership of the guild and could take on apprentices himself. This system produced craftsmen of extraordinary skill. The cathedrals and manuscripts and metalwork and cloth that survive from the medieval period testify to levels of craftsmanship that we struggle to equal today with all our technology. Chapter 17: Medieval Science and Natural Philosophy. The popular image of the Middle Ages as a period of pure superstition and ignorance, hostile to rational inquiry, is a caricature. The reality is far more interesting. Medieval thinkers were deeply interested in the natural world. They inherited from Aristotle the basic framework of natural philosophy, the idea that the natural world was intelligible, that it operated according to regular principles, and that human reason could discover and understand those principles. They combined this with the Christian conviction that God had created the world according to rational order, and that understanding creation was a form of worship. The result was not modern science. Medieval natural philosophy lacked the systematic experimental method, the mathematical precision, and the institutional structures of modern science. But it was not nothing. It was a serious, rigorous, creative engagement with questions about the natural world that laid important groundwork for the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Medieval scholars made real contributions to optics, mechanics, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural history. The Islamic world, with which medieval Europe was in increasingly close contact, transmitted not only Greek texts, but its own significant developments in algebra, trigonometry, astronomy, and medicine. The number system we use today, the so-called Arabic numerals, was actually developed in India and transmitted to Europe through Islamic scholarship, replacing the cumbersome Roman numeral system and making calculation vastly more efficient. Algebra, from the Arabic al-jabr, was introduced to Europe through the translation of Islamic texts. The concept of zero, which seems trivial until you try to do mathematics without it, came to Europe the same way. In astronomy, Medieval scholars worked within the Ptolemaic framework, the Earth-centered model of the cosmos developed by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century, but made increasingly sophisticated observations and calculations. The astrolabe, an instrument of Islamic origin, allowed medieval scholars to determine latitude, tell time, and make astronomical measurements with considerable accuracy. In medicine, the great medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, which drew on both Islamic and Greek medical traditions, was producing serious medical scholarship by the 11th century. The works of the Islamic physician Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, were translated into Latin and became standard medical texts in European universities. Medieval medicine was not effective by modern standards. It could not cure most of the diseases that killed people, but it was a serious intellectual discipline that accumulated real knowledge about the human body and its ailments. Roger Bacon, a 13th century English Franciscan friar, was one of the most remarkable scientific thinkers of the medieval period. He emphasized the importance of observation and experiment over mere authority, criticized the tendency to accept received wisdom without question, and speculated about technologies, flying machines, self-propelled vehicles, that would not be realized for centuries. He was not the creator of the scientific method, as he is sometimes portrayed, but he represents a significant current of empirical thinking within medieval intellectual life. The greatest scientific achievement of the medieval period, in terms of long-term influence, may have been the development and dissemination of the mechanical clock. Mechanical clocks with escapement mechanisms appeared in European churches and monasteries in the late 13th century. By the mid-14th century, elaborate mechanical clocks with striking mechanisms were being installed in town halls and cathedrals across Europe. The mechanical clock transformed the experience of time, making it regular, measurable, independent of the sun and the seasons. It was a fundamental prerequisite for the modern world. Chapter 18: Late Medieval Europe, Crisis and Transformation. The 14th and 15th centuries were a period of severe crisis in Europe. The Black Death was the most dramatic catastrophe, but it was not the only one. Famine, war, political instability, and a crisis of confidence in the Church all combined to make the late medieval period one of the most turbulent in European history. The Great Famine of 1315–1322 struck before the plague, killing perhaps 10% of the population of Northern Europe when a series of cold, wet summers destroyed harvests across the continent. Then came the plague. Then came the 100 Years' War, devastating France for generations. In the Holy Roman Empire, endless conflicts between emperors, princes, and cities kept the political landscape fragmented and violent. In Italy, the constant warfare between city-states, the brilliant, terrible, inventive world of medieval Italian politics that Machiavelli would later analyze, kept the peninsula in perpetual turmoil. The Church experienced its own crises. The most dramatic was the Great Schism of 1378–1417, when the Western Church had two, and briefly three, competing popes simultaneously, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of Peter, each excommunicating the others. The scandal was devastating to papal authority and to the faith of ordinary Christians who had been taught that the Pope was the vicar of Christ on earth. Which vicar? Which Christ? The schism was eventually resolved by the Council of Constance, 1414–1418, which deposed the competing claimants and elected a new pope who could command general recognition. But the reform movement associated with the council, conciliarism, the idea that a general council of the Church had authority superior to the Pope, remained a contested and troubling issue for the papacy for decades. More radical challenges to the Church's authority came from reform movements that the Church declared heretical. John Wycliffe in England argued that the Church's ownership of property was spiritually corrupting, that the Bible, not the Church's tradition, was the supreme authority for Christian life, and that the papacy had no legitimate secular power. His followers, the Lollards, translated the Bible into English and developed a popular reform movement that was suppressed but never entirely extinguished. In Bohemia, the Czech reformer Jan Hus, deeply influenced by Wycliffe, preached a similar message with even more explosive results. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance with a guarantee of safe conduct, was tried for heresy anyway, and was burned at the stake in 1415. His martyrdom ignited the Hussite Wars, a series of conflicts in Bohemia in which a Czech nationalist and reformist movement fought off multiple crusades sent against it by the Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy. The Hussites, using innovative military tactics including the famous Wagen Fortress, won battle after battle against conventionally armed crusading armies. The wars dragged on for decades and ended in a compromise that gave the Bohemian Church significant autonomy. The Hussite movement prefigured the Protestant Reformation in important ways. It demonstrated that a reform movement with popular support and nationalist overtones could successfully resist the combined forces of the institutional church and the secular authorities allied with it. The lesson was not lost on later reformers. And yet, amidst all this crisis, the late medieval period was also a time of remarkable cultural creativity. Chaucer was writing in England, Boccaccio and Petrarch in Italy, Christine de Pizan in France. The great Gothic cathedrals were being completed. Flemish painters were developing the techniques of oil painting and achieving levels of realistic detail and luminosity that would inspire artists for generations. Giotto in Italy was revolutionizing the representation of the human figure, giving his biblical characters psychological depth and physical presence that pointed toward the Renaissance. The universities were flourishing, filled with disputatious students arguing points of philosophy and theology with the passionate intensity that only young people convinced they are in possession of the truth can muster. Medical knowledge was slowly accumulating. Commercial and financial techniques were growing more sophisticated. The world was in crisis, but it was also alive, more alive in many ways than it had ever been. The contradictions of the late medieval period were not symptoms of a civilization in final collapse, but of one in the painful, difficult, sometimes violent process of transformation. Chapter 19. The End of the Middle Ages, TRNSITONS and THRSHOLDS. Historians draw the line between the Middle Ages and what comes after at different points and for different reasons. Some point to 1453 and the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, which sent Greek scholars and manuscripts flooding westward into Italy and accelerated the humanist movement. Some point to 1492 and Columbus's voyage to the Americas, which opened new worlds literally and figuratively, and shattered the medieval geographical imagination. Some point to 1517 and Martin Luther's challenge to the Church, which broke the religious unity of Latin Christendom that had been the defining characteristic of medieval civilization. All of these dates are legitimate markers of change, but the truth is that the Middle Ages did not end all at once. They faded, gradually, unevenly, in different places at different times, as the new grew out of the old, as it always does. The Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning and art that began in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, did not simply reject the medieval achievement. It built on it. Petrarch, often called the first Renaissance man, was deeply medieval in his religious feeling even as he pioneered a new approach to classical Latin. Dante Alighieri, who died in 1321, and whose Divine Comedy is one of the greatest works of European literature, drew on the full resources of medieval theology, philosophy, and courtly culture to create something entirely his own. The printing press, developed by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, was perhaps the single most transformative technological development of the transition from medieval to modern. It did not emerge from nowhere. It built on the medieval tradition of manuscript production, on the commercial networks of the Hanseatic merchants, on the intellectual hunger of the university world. But its effects were revolutionary. The rapid, cheap, wide dissemination of texts transformed the relationship between author, text, and reader in ways that are still being worked out. The Reformation that began with Luther in 1517 was in many ways the culmination of a century and more of reforming pressure within the medieval church. The pressure of the Lollards and Hussites, of the conciliarists and mystics, of all those who had looked at the institutional church and found it wanting. Luther himself was a medieval man in many ways, an Augustinian friar, a university theologian, a man who wrestled in the most anguished medieval fashion with the question of how a sinner could stand before a righteous God. But his answer, justification by faith alone, the authority of Scripture alone, the priesthood of all believers, shattered the institutional framework of medieval Christianity and set Europe on a path of religious fragmentation and conflict that would last for more than a century. And yet, even in the fragmentation, there was inheritance. The Protestant churches took the medieval universities and turned them into seminaries. They took the medieval tradition of biblical scholarship and multiplied it. They took the medieval emphasis on pastoral care and the devotional life of the laity and intensified it. The Reformation was a revolution that could only have happened in a world deeply shaped by the medieval church it was revolting against. Epilogue: what the Middle Ages gave us. We have traveled a long way together, from the ruins of Rome to the threshold of the modern world, across more than 1,000 years of European history. We have met emperors and saints, peasants and merchants, crusaders and mystics, plague victims and cathedral builders. We have watched civilizations rise and fall, religions spread and fracture, landscapes transform. What did the Middle Ages give us? They gave us our languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, English, German. All of these emerged in their recognizable forms during the medieval period, shaped by the collision and fusion of Latin with Germanic and other tongues. They gave us our legal systems. The common law of England, the Roman law of the continent, both have medieval roots. The concept of due process, of trial by jury, of written constitutions limiting royal power, all have medieval precedents. They gave us our universities: Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Paris, Salamanca. All were medieval foundations, and the institutions they created persist in the structures of higher education today. They gave us our architecture. The great cathedrals stand as the most durable and beautiful monuments of the medieval achievement, but also the castle, the fortified town, the market hall, the guild house. All of these architectural forms shaped the European townscape in ways still visible today. They gave us our music, the traditions of choral singing that emerged from the medieval church, Gregorian chant, polyphony, the development of musical notation, are the ancestors of the Western classical tradition. They gave us our literature: Beowulf and the Song of Roland, the Divine Comedy and the Canterbury Tales, the Arthurian romances and the Nibelungenlied. The great narratives of the medieval world continue to inspire writers, filmmakers, and artists. They gave us, perhaps most importantly, the basic institutions and habits of thought that make the modern West what it is. The university, the corporation, the parliament, the idea of the rule of law, the concept of individual conscience before God, the notion that secular and spiritual authority are distinct, and that neither should simply absorb the other. These were not the intended products of the medieval experiment. They emerged from conflict, from compromise, from the creative tension between different claims on human loyalty, to Lord, to church, to community, to God, to the self. They were worked out in the arguments of schoolmen and the battles of kings, in the prayers of monks and the calculations of merchants, in the visions of mystics and the innovations of engineers. The Middle Ages were not a gap in history. They were history as vivid, as human, as consequential as any other period. The men and women who lived through them felt joy and grief, hope and despair, love and hatred, faith and doubt, with the same intensity that we feel these things today. They were not primitive predecessors waiting for us to arrive. They were fully human, fully alive, fully themselves. And now, as our long journey through their world draws to a close, let us sit for a moment in the quiet that follows. Imagine the great nave of a Gothic cathedral, late in the evening, the candles nearly burned down, the last light of day coming through the western windows in long golden shafts that catch the dust motes floating in the air. The day's prayers have been said. The monks have gone to their cells. The town is settling into sleep. The stone is cold and still. The silence is very old. "All shall be well," wrote Julian of Norwich. "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Sleep now. Rest in the long, strange, beautiful story of our past. You are part of it, whether you know it or not. Every word you speak, every law that protects you, every song you love, carries traces of the 1,000 years we have just walked through together. The Middle Ages are over, but they are not gone. Good night.